always something. There's always something. I said yes to this one first before.
I'd like to call this meeting to order. I'd like to welcome each one here. I just want to, for some new faces here, to just go around the table here and you just say our name. Paul Heffer.
Amanda Piskorski.
Joan Vandermeer, Lou Cole,
Bill Farnell.
Dwayne Evans.
Carson William.
Brock Vadden.
Doug Kaiserhoven.
Vicki Rutenberger.
Thank you. Can I have a motion to accept the agenda for the September 19th, 2019 Museum Committee meeting? Do I have a mover?
I will.
And I'll second.
Lou? Second? Bill. Thank you. All those in favor? Thank you. Declaration of pecuniary interest. Does anyone have to declare any pecuniary interest? Knowing none. Anybody from the public that would like to speak on something for 2 minutes concerning the agenda? Seeing none. Okay. Has everyone had an opportunity to review the minutes from the previous meeting? Okay. Then ask if you have a motion to approve the minutes. Do I have a mover? A seconder? Bill, thank you. Motion is carried.
Vote all in favor.
All in favor? Sorry, Paul.
All in favor.
Did I see enough hands there? Delegations? Seeing none? Reports? We've had to rearrange the order of items in order to accommodate staff's presence at another meeting. So with us today is the Township CO, Dwayne Evans, and Dwayne will be reviewing item 7.2, terms of reference, and 7.3, work plan. And I believe Carson's helping out there too. I'd like to turn it over to Dwayne at this time.
Sure. Thanks, Chair. So I was asked to, if I could come today, perhaps, I understand at the last meeting there were varying levels of knowledge and information among the various committee members. So I was just asked to, if I could assist in terms of bringing everyone to the same point in terms of where we're at in the process. I see that there is a package of material here, which is very, very good and very comprehensive in terms of where we are and where we're at. But just, I mean, essentially, I'll just put it in a nutshell and if there's any questions. Back in 2017, there was a condition facility assessment report completed on the museum building as it currently exists. And that report came back and basically indicated that it was going to take $3.8 million for us to bring it up to standards in terms of accessibility standards. It needs HVAC system, pointing, etc. And so the question of the council of the day in terms of how are we going to proceed? And so what staff did was we put together, and I see it in the package here, a flow chart to assist council in the decision-making process. So as in terms of, we have the museum consists of the artifacts, and there's also the programming component of the museum as well. So there's two aspects to it. In terms of the building, again, it was going to take $3.8 million to bring it to where we need to have it. And council, the previous council or council of the day indicated that we're not prepared to spend that.
Can you just elaborate right that moment on maybe a few of the things that were talked about in bringing that up to par on that $3 million?
Yeah, it's in the report, but things like we as a municipality, we're we're subject, well, and businesses too are subject to the Accessibility Ontario Disabilities Act, AODA. And that, for example, if you, just as it's a 3-story building, and it doesn't have an elevator.
We know.
So there's no way of getting to the 3rd floor, and yet it's a public building, right? And when you go in the building itself, there's stairs right inside the building. So there was accessibility requirements that the building is significantly lacking. In terms of the HVAC system, the heating and cooling system, there is no air conditioning in that building. And in speaking with museum experts, you want a climate-controlled environment for your artifacts. So essentially, what happened at that point was we started a process in terms of looking at the museum and looking at the collection and what the future was going to be for that. One of the options that's been investigated, or has been investigated, is looking at other buildings. So we undertook to look at 4 or 5 different buildings in the municipality where we could possibly, move out of the existing building and set up a museum. And with that, we had Elizabeth French Gibson join us, and I understand she's coming to your meeting in October. She's a senior curator at the County of Huron, so she works in museum field all the time. She was invited and she attended council, and she gave what the museum of today is and what the museums of today look like. Our attendance at the museum was on a significant decline, and our revenue was down. And it was costing the municipality money in terms of having the museum. Going back, we looked at different buildings in the municipality, well, more so Wingham. The museum, the direction was to look at buildings in Wingham. And so we looked at 4 or 5 different buildings. And we came back to council and presented the buildings that were available. None of the buildings from the financial, at that point, the financial feasibility was not there. As a result of that discussions and that process, Doug in particular, with the train station, indicated that he'd be willing to loan, I don't know how you want to term it, donate the train station building to assist in terms of having a museum in the municipality. And so what happened was we went down and we looked at that particular building. And if you've been in that building, just in terms of the layout, at that point there was some discussion starting about a museum, but also what about a tourism or welcoming center. And just in terms of that particular building, when you walk inside the front door, there's an open area at the front that could be used for a museum tourism center. And then the back of part of the building could be used for a museum. And so then there were some ideas and discussions that were generated around that. Taking consideration that, for example, the Alice Munro exhibit that is currently in the museum, when you go into the train station and you go into the back, there's a little separate room there. So the discussion was that perhaps that could be permanent Alice Munro area, and then the rest of the space would be used for museum or for programming. And the suggestions that were coming forward from Elizabeth at the time, and I'm sure she'll talk about them when she comes here, was to have a rotating exhibit. One of the things you'll hear her talk about is the static displays of a museum. A static museum doesn't attract people. Once they come, if you have a static museum and they come and see it, they come and see it once. And what I think you'll hear her say, or what we heard her say, was you want it that people are going to come back to it. So her suggestion was to consider having rotating exhibits in the train station. And then she went so far as to give us some suggestions, from October until December, you could have a veterans, and from January to March, you could have, you know, like a North Huron, whether you wanna highlight the hospital, you know, the history of the hospital, the history of CCANX, or that sort of thing. So that was, so this was,
I don't wanna be too interfering here
No.
because, maybe I should just wait until she arrives a second time round so I can ask her some of these things. I don't wanna take you too far off
No.
what you were hoping to say. Well, one of the questions I would ask right there is, was the discussion leading to having, rotating, displays done by local people who are involved, or plugging into the rotating exhibits that are offered by the Ontario Heritage programmers? Or was she saying, use both if you can, or whatever?
well,
I'm just interested in, you know, where this came from and from whom, and what the background of those people are,
Mhm.
so that I can feel on board with where we're going now.
Mhm. And I'll come back to that in a minute.
Okay.
But just in terms of the whole, and I don't think, Elizabeth can talk in October, and I think certainly you could have both in terms of having the temporary exhibits and that. Essentially, I think at the time Elizabeth's comment or point was, you want change. You want to have a reason for people to come back into your museum. And if you have one display and you have it there for 20 years, people aren't going to come back.
But most museums anymore don't operate that way at all anyway.
Well, and that, but just in terms of our museum, that's how, like,
I don't think that's fair.
well, no, just in terms of, the museum is a collection, which is great, but in terms of the rotation, right?
No,
Okay.
I'm going to stand up against that, because I think I know. And we worked very, very hard not. There were some static exhibits, but at the same time, we were constantly putting in different ones to bring in different people and to program toward those. And all I'm saying is I'm coming from that background.
Yeah.
And so as we discuss things, I want to stand up for what has gone on and be very open to what should go on.
Yeah.
Now, sorry,
No,
thank
that's
you.
fine, that's fine. So just in terms of, Doug brought forward, the train station building, and, essentially, council, at the time went into lame duck, and so things kind of came to a, slowed, or nothing more could be done until our new council came into office. So just in terms of council itself, council basically is, in terms of the work that this committee is doing, there's a number of questions that are not, if this move is to happen, which council hasn't said they're going to do the move yet or not. At this point, it's a proposal to council in terms of what this could be, what it could look like. And not to jump ahead, but just in terms of, with the terms of reference, the whole idea with the plans is to essentially answer those questions, correct? Is, what, how could it be, what it could look like, et cetera. In terms of, the existing building, the indications are that we're not going to put the 3.8 million into the building. So the question then becomes, what's the future of the museum at this point? So that's where I don't know, Brock, you were any history, is there anything I've missed that, in a high level overview?
No, I don't think so. I agree with Lou's call, Lou, about the activity in but there was a lot of programming done by that volunteer group for many years, and without any support from council whatsoever. I think that's been unfortunate.
So I'm not going to go into any more, like, I'll answer questions. You've got all the information in your package here. So in
Yes, I'm
terms of-
sorry about that, because I haven't read all of this, I
Oh,
just
that's
got it.
fine.
So I was jumping on you for things I can sit down and read, but you're not gonna be beside me.
Okay, so there's no more questions for our CEO?
Can anybody say a little bit more, Doug, or you say a little bit more about the concept of tourism and museum? Can you say a little bit more about that?
I serve on the BIA, the Business Association in town, I'm chair of that. And the BIA, we're about attracting more people to town, just putting William on the map. And it's good for everybody. So one of the things that we identified, we were doing some like brainstorming about the things that William has, the assets and the things that William needs. One of the things that came up on a list that we did when we were going through the strategic plan stuff was that we could use a visitor information center. And so with the train station idea, it seemed to be a nice fit. If there was a staff person from the town there at the train station, then being able to stop in and like, here's a visitor information center, get information about what goes on and what's going on around town and in the area.
And I would ask there, Doug, for a comment about the overlap of staffing. Because I think I heard Vicki say last time that she might be involved from her particular position. I also heard you say last meeting that, we could make use of students and so on, and I'm not against students. But I think anybody who has been involved in museum, and Bill, I don't know your thought on this too, you've got to know something about why you are being called a museum in order to welcome people to come through and not just say, well, you could walk around. And I just don't know whether there has been involved discussion around the overlapping of those two uses of the venue, or what you thought about.
So if I can just speak to that a little bit. So a lot of that is going to come out when the committee starts talking about the museum operation plan. So none of these things are set in stone. There's no set way of how it's going to look like. That's one of the roles of this committee is to kind of develop a way where this museum, if council goes for this proposal, what it's going to look like going forward, whether it's sustainable to have tourism and the museum together, how it's staffed, those kind of things. Those are all stuff that will have to be sorted out by
All
the
I'm
committee.
trying to do here is to get a little bit of base for myself, so that when I sit around and be an active member of the proposal committee for programming and for it, I understand what's already been said, what the idea was for the two to overlap or to overstaff.
There's been no detailed discussion on that. Like,
Okay.
that is exactly what Carson said, that's
Okay.
part of the role of this committee, is to look at.
All right, but I appreciate that comment, Doug, because if there has been no involved discussion, then the committee can go from ground zero. If there already has been a lot of things that have been said, that won't work, then there's no sense spending a whole lot of time discussing it and putting it into a plan.
Yep, and you make a valid point there. Ultimately, the committee is developing a proposal from ground zero
Okay,
of how things are going to look, and they're going to be presented
okay,
at the council.
thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. It was just, there's just been a lot of concepts and ideas tossed around, and that's where we were coming from. Is
All
that-
right.
Yeah, because there was a lot of questions about, well, does this have to be staffed, and can you staff a township, and so it was just ideas.
All right, thank you.
Like, Lou, it's just been at a very high level, very conceptual. I think one of the
Just tell me
overriding
why.
things that we probably are gonna have to understand is there's no money, okay? Like, we can't just say, oh, we want $100,000 to run this thing, or $200,000 to make it go, and this, have all kinds of staff, and, you know, that's not gonna fly with council, I kinda say that right now. We just can't be pie in the sky. And so, the high-level concept that I've bounced around with Bernie and Vicky is, moving one of Vicky's staff persons over there, but she doesn't become a full-time, museum curator slash,
Well, she couldn't.
so
That's
that
not
person
fair.
is doing their job, but just simply there, visible, available to help, and they would take on maybe the role of coordinating volunteers, but they don't become a full-time museum curator. paid
Sorry,
by the
Doug,
township.
I just think there's not a lot of use in doing a lot of discussion around things that have already been said,
Right.
no. So I hear no money. That's maybe the most important thing I need to hear. Okay,
Thank you.
thanks.
At this time, we'll go to 7.2. Carson, thank you.
Oh, sorry. I just want to speak to that one for a second. I vision this as a volunteer. You guys have been volunteering for years. I know that for a fact because I was just up the street for 35 years. This is not to get rid of our volunteers. This is to engage our volunteers very clearly. What we decide to do and how we move forward will always include our volunteers. And this is not going to be a staff person up there running it, telling anybody what to do. You guys have done a fantastic job, and I'm hoping you're going to continue.
I'm not coming in wanting that kind of thing. We did what we did, and we were glad to do it, and so on. But you start putting the term museum on something, and you are into something that's got to reflect the fact you understand what that word means. And that was worrying me when I left here last time. Thank you.
Carson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, I've been asked to come here today to kind of go through the terms of reference for the committee. So basically, this is going through what the role of the committee is, what their mandate, the resources you guys have available, how to access those resources, that kind of thing. So Dwayne touched on the background information, so I'm not going to really get into that. But basically, the mandate of this committee, as Dwayne alluded to, was to develop a proposal for council's consideration. So council hasn't made any firm decisions that the museum is going to be moved. So the role of this committee is ultimately to develop a proposal that can be presented to council for their consideration of whether or not to move the museum artifact into the old former train station building. So basically, the idea of this committee was to develop something different than what was going on before in a way that was going to be sustainable. So as Dwayne touched on before, the amount of people coming through the museum was on a decline, and it wasn't financially feasible for the museum to keep operating the way it was. So this is an opportunity for this committee to develop something that will be sustainable in the long term. And so some of the decisions of the committee would be like what kind of stuff should go in the new museum, such as whether it be rotating exhibits, whether it's a tourism center, basically anything there, what could make this financially sustainable in the long run so that it can be a success for North Huron is the role of this committee. So basically what council has asked is for the development of 4 plans. The first of these plans is the work plan, and that consists of the detailed plans of the 3 other plans. And basically, so this work plan, which is an example of a work plan, is that chart you guys have in front of you. And basically it outlines the items and activities and the target dates for this committee to meet those deadlines. And once this work plan is developed, ultimately it gets approved by the committee, and then it goes to council and council approves it. So with the example 1, so that's from another one of our committees. What they did is basically they had a discussion of the kinds of things that need to be considered. So that would be your action items and when they should be considered in what order kind of thing. And then basically staff took those items back, they developed this chart, brought it back to the committee again to look at, and then basically the committee looked at it and said, oh, we should consider this and this instead, we should move this around, and ultimately they ended up approving that, and then, so just like that, and then this one would go to council for approval. And so, one of the important things is for council is the timeline, right? So this committee has till the end of the 2019-2022 term of council. So ultimately, it's a good way for staff to measure what kind of things should be on the agendas going forward in order to help the committee achieve these activities and meet those timelines. So with the work plan, which is the first one that needs to be completed before the other 3 work plans can be developed, is this chart. And as Dwayne had mentioned, that Elizabeth, the curator for the Huron County Museum, will be in attendance in the October meeting. So that would be a good opportunity to ask her what kind of activities and what kind of things need to be done and in what order, in order to try and make this project a sustainable and well-developed proposal going forward that can be presented to council. So then the township resources that are available to the committee. So that is on the 4th page of the terms of reference. And basically, the point to get across here is what resources are available to the committee and how the committee goes about accessing those resources. And so basically, from my understanding, was there was some discussions of subcommittees at the previous meeting, and ultimately council didn't grant the authority of this committee to develop their own subcommittees. So what it says here is the director of recreation, so Vicky, is the staff support person on this project. And so whenever expertise or advice from an outside individual who's not on the committee is required of the committee, that would be a request to be made to Vicky, and then Vicky will do the communicating back and forth, and there's opportunity for them to come to the committee meeting as a delegation, and so those things would get scheduled by Vicky and Mandy. And so in the terms of reference, it does say that the Huron County Museum curator from time to time may provide guidance, input, and review the work of the committee. So ultimately, if the committee's at a stage where they think they need Elizabeth to come in and review the work, then that can be scheduled with Vicky, and Elizabeth can attend as a delegation. But ultimately, the role of this committee is not to kind of break up into subcommittees, but it's kind of develop it as a whole, and then get that expert opinion through delegations. So then for financial resources, it says here that no financial resources are available, but if something comes up where the committee deems this as necessary, a request can be made, and it also says the director of recreation can bring that request to council for their consideration. So if the committee reaches a point where they feel that a certain speaker is required to come present to the committee, and they have to come here, but there is a fee associated with it, Vicky can bring that request to council, and council can deem whether it's appropriate or not. So then the last piece to the terms of reference here that I just want to touch on is the committee's role in relation to the other 3 plans. So as I touched on with the work plan, that's the activities and items that need to be carried out in order for the other 3 plans to be developed. So of those other 3 plans, the first one's the project plan, and basically that indicates how the relocation and the establishment of the museum to the former train station will be undertaken. So what will that move look like? And that will also include a beneficial approach, so that might also include making a chart that includes the activities and items that would need to be undertaken in that project plan. The plan after that is the museum operation plan, and so that includes governance model, funding, the the things like that that are going to allow this move to the former train station to be sustainable going forward. So basically, how is it going to operate? How is it going to run? How is it going to be staffed? Whether that includes rotating exhibits, basically, all the things that would be required to operate the museum so that it can maintain success in the long term is what's kind of considered in this plan. So basically, with this, council was they didn't want to just know how the move was going to happen. They wanted to know how the move is going to happen, and then how is that going to be sustained in the long term into a successful operations. So whether it's volunteer based or whether there's a staffing arrangement, that kind of thing. And then the final plan is a fundraising plan, which is how are the funds going to be raised to undertake the activities that are required of the operating plan. So whether there's grants available, that kind of thing, and how will this committee kind of get the required funding going forward. But overall, these three plans are just to kind of show to council that this has the potential for long-term success, and it's not just going to be a short-term move and that's that, right? And then where North Huron ends up in the same position that they were in before, where there's a museum there that's not financially viable going forward. So basically those three plans will speak to new ways to approach this, whether the municipality contributes funds to it, or the municipality takes on the building and other organizations contribute to it, but basically how is this going to look like in the long term. So then the other piece I have here is just on the very last page, and it's just that should any member like to bring forward an item of business, so say something hasn't been captured in the work plan, but you as a committee member feel it's important to discuss, the way to go about doing that is you would reach out to Mandy, who plans the agendas, and then basically between her and Vicky, it can get on the agenda and be discussed by the committee.
I have a question for you, Carson. To me, and I am a former project manager, it would make sense to me that before we go ahead and do all that planning, that we actually seriously look at the standards for community museums of Ontario to determine if there's even any possibility that we can meet the standards, because if we can't meet the standards, how are we going to get funding to be sustainable?
Yep, and I believe that's something Vicky has incorporated for the October meeting when Elizabeth is going to be here as well.
Through your chair, and we included those standards in the package.
Yes, that's why I
So
read them.
Yeah, so that you can review them and have enough time to review them before we have Elizabeth come to speak to us.
Yeah, that was a red flag for me. When I read them, I thought, before we do all this work, we should be looking at, can we even meet the standards?
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Carson, please? Go ahead, Rob.
I have a question about the existing old post office. It's clear that council has decided they're not going to spend $4 million on repairing it, but what is going to be done with it? What use will be made of it? And where do we get the money to tear it down if that's what, that'll be a very costly process in itself, I would think.
Okay, I turn that question over to Blaine, please.
Yeah, just in terms of, so there's no decisions that have been made with respect to the future of the building, in terms of, so there's different options. It could be repurposed, it could be sold to a private developer, and as you said, it could be tore down, but that is a decision, there's a number of decisions that need to be made by council. That is a decision at some point that will need to be made by council. But that, from my perspective, is a decision kind of further down the road. We can't do anything with the building until we decide how we're going to proceed with the contents of the building.
I'm just concerned, I don't want to send this out for a lengthy discussion, but it's such an iconic building. The loss of it would be enormous to this community, I think. Looking at it from the external side, I know the troubles that are inside, but I'm just concerned about what would be lost if the building is torn down or repurposed in a damaging way.
Further to that, Brock, I think it's one of two left in Ontario that were post offices with a clock tower. Well, that's pretty important.
I agree.
Any other questions for either Carson or Dwayne, please? Seeing none? Okay, I'll turn it to Becky now, 7.1.
So, in your package, we basically gathered or compiled a lot of the reports and information that had been presented to the previous council, as well as provided to the new council to bring them up to speed. We thought, there were a lot of questions at the last meeting, and it kind of made us realize that maybe some people had more information or was more familiar with, what had occurred and things than others. So, has everyone had a chance to read those reports, or some of the reports, or
Just,
you just pictures up? Yeah, okay. Well, 7.1.1 was the original report, that came forward to council on October 16th of 2017. And that report provided the findings of the facility condition assessment for the building. Attached to the report is the assessment and in more detail as to the different issues that are associated with the building and things, and it provides a breakdown of the costs. Lou, you were asking, what are the issues and things like that. So it does talk about the stonework, it talks about the HVAC system, so there's issues with the roof, the electrical, HVAC and things. And then it also provides those estimated costs to do the repairs. And as the CAO mentioned, it's between $3.8 and $3.9 million to repair it. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on it unless there's specific questions and things, but just kind of give you an idea. Like there's issues with the exterior masonry, roofing, the windows, the doors, interior finishes, accessibility is obviously an issue, and there's just general mechanical and electrical issues as well, which is the largest portion of the repairs that need to occur over there. I believe all of you, have you worked in there, Jill? Have you volunteered in there and things?
I have managed projects where we put people in there to work, so
Yeah.
I liaised with Connie.
So you know there's issues with,
Yes.
with cooling and heating, maintaining temperature, and there without there being any air conditioning and things like that. So in the report, again, it's a condition assessment, and it goes into providing more detail about the issues with the building itself and things. And then the next report is 7.1.2. That came forward on April 3rd, 2018. And at that point, they were discussing, there was a meeting in between there. It was actually a budget meeting when council decided to discontinue the program for 2018 and close the building. So the April report, it discusses council's decision to discontinue the programming, close the building for 2018. And it identifies really that there's 4 components to the museum itself. There is the building, to the decisions associated with the museum itself, I should say. It's the building itself, but then there's the whole issue of the programming and the artifacts. And then there's the Barn Dance Museum, and then there's the Alice Munro Artifacts and Museum. So it broke it down into 4 different sections for consideration and things. and it speaks to each of those. Regarding different things about them and, and what they're about. For instance, the Barn Dance Museum that was located on the lower floor, but they were actually almost like a tenant of the municipalities and things. So different components that you have to give consideration to when you're making a proposal as to how these are going to be accommodated at that location down there. It talks about, that there are serious inadequacies of that existing building, like I mentioned, mechanical and electrical. It also talks about, that the building does not meet the building code, or the HVAC requirements for museums. There was a portion of it that talked about that there was a tour of the museum with the artifact professionals, and I believe that would be Elizabeth that toured that museum. And she was talking about there were some artifacts in the collection that were not being properly stored, like textiles and things, and made specific reference to that, and that needs to be taken into consideration, moving forward on how we're going to store those things, because they need to be properly stored. The building does have a heritage design, designation. The building is of architectural and historical significance and was deemed so by the province. The municipality actually applied for that. The municipality can apply that be removed if it wished to, but it's the building itself, not the museum program, that's been deemed heritage designation. Stakeholders, that report identifies that the stakeholders involved over there is the Barn Dance Museum, Alice Munro Artifacts and Garden, Friends of the Museum, and the community, the township and the community as the main stakeholders for that. It also provided some information with respect to attendance, our visitor attendance and things, and compared it to Strathroy Caradoc as well, which was a smaller museum. And it points out that provincial funding is available, but there are specific requirements or criteria that must be met in order for a community museum to receive that funding. But it also stated that the province isn't accepting applications at this point. So Elizabeth also talks, then there was her presentation things where she talked about, and everyone got a link to her presentation and things, and I believe there was reference in there about how museums operate now are a little bit different than in the past, and the static type displays are not the way to go if you want to continue and have successful operations, and that a lot of museums have to recreate themselves. There were additional staff presentations over the summer, and they were in July and August, and those presentations basically discussed or looked at the potential of relocating the museum to a different building, and it looked at the vacant properties in the Wingham area, which Dwayne had mentioned, and identified what the purchase price would be for all of those properties. The one property that did not have a purchase price associated with it was the train museum, and they seem to focus on that because of the offer to have it donated to the township, subject to some terms and conditions. It also talked about that presentation, the presentations over the summer talked about the costs that are associated with various options associated with the decisions council must make. So if council decides just to close the museum in its entirety, no programming or whatever, there's definitely going to be some costs associated with that, with having to deaccession the items and things like that. But it also had estimated costs in there of moving the museum programming component, not not the building, but the programming component to a different location. So that's in that report as well. Following that, the next report then comes up in January. We had a new council on board. I did a summary report that summarized all these other reports and the information that you have in your packages. And just kind of reviewed with them, you know, that if we did relocate the museum programming to a different location, what those costs were again. And then we've included in your, that was in January, and in February, there was a presentation to council. I believe it was in February, it was a presentation to council when the meeting was held at the Knights of Columbus Center, and things at which we had committee members, some of the members that are here in this room came forward and attended that meeting and asked council to consider the move. And then council approved basically a committee being set up and directed staff to set up the terms of reference for a committee to look at the potential of moving museum itself to the train station location and developing a proposal for council to consider. We've included in your package on like 7.1.7, just excerpts from the council meetings, just kind of a quick summary of the different decisions council has made to bring you kind of up to date and pull that out of all the information. I know it's a lot of information that was in the packages and things, so we have that in there. The next thing that we basically have, because Dwayne and Carson's covered off in terms of reference in the work plan, is 7.4, we provided you with those standards for community museum in Ontario. We wanted to provide that to you ahead of time, so that you would have time to kind of review it and prepare for Elizabeth French Gibson coming to the meeting in October, so you could ask her her questions and going forward from that point. Did you want to go over that and more review that today, or is everyone okay just kind of reviewing it on their own and then being prepared for Elizabeth?
I read it all. I think,
Sorry, go ahead.
I think because some of us have, and some people just got it, I read it electronically, like, we're not all on the same page, it was probably beneficial to just read it.
To wait? Okay, that's fine. Then, it's an interesting document, because it talks about different governance models in there that can be used too. It talks about whether or not a board is established and runs it directly, or if it's run by the municipality, and those are the types of things that you're gonna have to take into consideration when you're making your proposal to council. And I think that was one of the things that we were, after the last meeting, we were kind of thinking, okay, this really moved ahead really quickly, and there needed to be some other decisions made as a group as to how, like, what you're envisioning, envisioning the museum to look like or operate as if it moved to the train station. So, we also had in there a copy of the museum budget, and we provided basically copy of the budget, and it depicts the budget and the actuals from 2014 to 2017, to give you an idea of what it was costing to operate the building and the programs. The cost to operate the building in 2018 was not included, since the building was not operating as a museum, but for your records, it was approximately $10,000. I think it's just operational costs over there. And then at the last meeting, there was a question about the legacy money. So we did speak with the Director of Finance, and there is still money in I believe, a trust account, and the amount is $5,187 and change.
So any questions? Sorry.
Yes, I have a question then about what, the funds of the museum fundraising account on page 80 of her package. Council had passed a motion saying that the money be transferred to the Horticultural Society. Is that the same money or is that a different pot of money?
This is a different, my
Okay,
understanding is this is a different pot of money.
That was money raised by the Friends of.
okay,
Yes.
okay. Thank you.
Any other questions for Vicky? Okay, no correspondence. So next steps, I take it, is Elizabeth French Gibson will bring a delegation to our next meeting. Our scheduling for the next meeting is October 17th, 2019 at 2 p.m. Would you like to add anything to that? She's got lots of questions.
Yeah, certainly bring your questions for her, review that, the community museum standards, because she will be, speaking to that and able to answer your questions, regarding that. And even if you have other questions, because I had phoned her after the meeting, Joan had already spoken with her, but I phoned her after the meeting to talk to her a little bit too, because I had the museum, standards, and wanted to check with her to see if anything had changed, since she had last been here and things, so.
Any other questions? Seeing none?
Did you handle the correspondence from John Rutledge?
That's coming to the next one.
Next meeting.
Oh, okay. Well, I just figured it's correspondence.
Okay, so that the North Huron Museum Committee agrees that there being no further business before the committee, the meeting be hereby adjourned at 2:52. Do you have a mover? Brock? Second? Carrie? All in favor? Carrie.